If I was to ask you who is the worst scientist in history, how would you decide? Would it be the one who hurt the most people through their research? Would it be someone who did careless research knowing that it might hurt innocent civilians? Would it be somebody who has the worst methods in science? Well, what if I was to tell you that our subject of today's video ticks all of those boxes? And not only that, they are also the #1 most retracted scientist in history. That's right, today we're going right to the very top of the Retraction Watch leaderboard to look at a German scientist called Yim Bolt. A scientist whose scandal broke over a decade ago, but only this year, through the slow process of retracting his papers, has he finally topped the list. So today we're going to talk about Yim Bolt. Now, if you haven't been exposed to academic fraudsters like Yim Bolt before, it could be because you have a blind spot in the news that you're consuming, which is where the sponsor of today's video can come in really handy, and that is Ground News. You see, the news that we consume these days can often be extremely biased depending on the source that we're getting it from. For example, if we look at this story, which is about how Anthony Fauci will testify before Congress on COVID origins and the US pandemic response, seems appropriate for this story since we're talking about medicine today. So as you can see from the coverage distribution, this story was almost completely ignored by left-leaning media. In fact, there were only 2 sources on the left that were covering this news story at all. One of them, however, was AP News, a high factuality news source that does tend to lean left. And if we look at the title of this story, it says, Anthony Fauci will testify before Congress on COVID origins and the US pandemic response. A very low emotion, very to the point title. However, if we look at a right-leaning news source and one that is low factuality, for example, this one from the Western Journal, we can see that the title is a lot more emotive. Fauci to be grilled by Republican-controlled House in both private and public hearings. Now, the reason why I was able to find this story at all is thanks to the blind spot feature here on Ground News, which highlights stories that are predominantly covered by only one side of the political spectrum. And by using Ground News, I can then compare titles like this to see how different factualities and different political biases affect the way that the same story is being talked about. And in addition to the blind spot feature, which is the first great feature that Ground News has to help combat news bias, they have another feature called the My News Bias Dashboard. And the My News Bias Dashboard basically gives you feedback on the news that you're consuming, so you can see whether you're predominantly consuming news media that falls onto one side of the political spectrum or the other. I find this kind of data feedback really helpful to make sure that I'm not consuming news that is too, left-leaning or right-leaning. So if you'd like to access the My News Bias Dashboard too, then make sure you sign up for the Vantage plan with Ground News, which is the plan that I have. If you use my link in the description, you'll get 30% off the Vantage plan. Sorry, did I say 30% off the Vantage plan? I actually meant 40% off the Vantage plan if you use my link in the description. Thank you again to Ground News for sponsoring today's video. Let's get back to the story of Yim Bolt. So in the 2000s, Bolt is considered a leader in the world of anesthesiology. He specifically is an expert in the world of colloids. So if you don't know what a colloid is, mayonnaise is a really good example. Mayonnaise is made of oil and vinegar, 2 substances which typically don't mix well together, but by adding egg yolk to oil and vinegar, suddenly those 2 substances can live next to each other, and by doing so, those 2 substances can now exist next to each other without separating into layers, and that is essentially a colloid. Now, Yim Bolt wasn't an expert in mayonnaise, but the colloid that he was interested in was called hydroxyethyl starch, or HES for short. And what Yim Bolt's research focused on was the use of hydroxyethyl starch, or HES, in order to boost blood pressure after surgery. Now, apparently, Bolt got very famous off the back of this research. He was considered a leader in the field, and that's because his research was used extensively to justify the use of hydroxyethyl starch as the way to boost blood pressure post-surgery. But hydroxyethyl starch is controversial, not only because the safety of it is called into question, something which we'll touch more on later, but also because hydroxyethyl starch is quite expensive. It's much more expensive than other intravenous fluids like crystalloids, for example, which apparently are significantly cheaper. But despite its high cost, hospitals across Europe was and sometimes continue to use hydroxyethyl starch as their primary way of boosting blood pressure post-surgery. And a lot of that, like I said, was justified by Yim Bolt's research. But things began to unfold for Bolt in 2009. You see, in December of 2009, the journal Anesthesia and Analgesia published a study comparing 2 bypass priming solutions. One was albumin, which is that weird white stuff that you see coming out of salmon sometimes, and, well, you guessed it, hydroxyethyl starch. Now, this paper by Yim Bolt, as you can imagine, justified the use of hydroxyethyl starch in surgery. Apparently, the results showed a remarkable ability for hydroxyethyl starch to cause coagulation of the blood and increase blood pressure. But 2 weeks after this paper was published, the chief editor of the paper, a guy called Stephen Schaefer, receives 2 letters from readers who are concerned about the authenticity of this research. The main thing that these readers were concerned by was the very high level of statistical significance and the extremely low standard deviation. They thought that this low standard deviation was extremely weird, especially because this was a paper done on very few patients. You see, while I'm not a doctor, there are a lot of parallels between how we conduct research in psychology and in medicine. And one of the biggest things that we know is that in order to increase the validity of your findings, you need to have a large sample size. The bigger the sample size, the smaller the standard deviation. The smaller the sample size, the bigger the standard deviation. You can think of standard deviation essentially as uncertainty in your result. So to these readers of the paper, it was weird, right? You have this study with a very tiny sample size and somehow an also very tiny standard deviation, and apparently, and almost to quote the readers of the paper, a magic effect on blood coagulation and blood pressure. Now, having received these allegations, Schaefer was obviously concerned, but at this point in the story, he assumes that it must be some kind of innocent error. After all, Bolt was a prolific member of the anesthesiology community. He publishes one paper apparently about once a month. And on top of that, Bolt on all of these papers had multiple co-authors who you would assume would have been able to at least corroborate the data before publishing. And of course, the paper went through the normal journal's peer review system. And so you would hope again that any kind of strange anomalies like this would be caught in peer review. But as we've explained on this channel before, all of those things, peer review, multiple co-authors, all of that, doesn't mean anything for how valid a paper is, because there are many flaws in the system. And sure enough, when Schaefer looked into the paper by Bolt, he found something else that was weird about the paper beyond just the weirdly small standard deviation. And that was the fact that after surgery, all the patients had a perfect acid-base balance. If you don't know what an acid-base balance is, essentially after surgery, doctors have to check the acidity of the patient's blood. Typically, a healthy patient will be between 7.35 and 7.45 on the pH scale. But because of surgery, that balance can be thrown out of whack due to things like blood loss. So generally, after surgery, the acid-base balance won't be perfect. But according to Bolt's paper, all of the patients in this study had perfect acid-base balance after surgery. And according to Schaefer, this was never seen ever in the history of the world. So clearly this is a red flag. There's something up with this paper. So over the next few weeks, Schaefer tries doggedly to get a hold of Bolt. He sends him emails, he calls him multiple different times, and Bolt just ghosted him. Schaefer said he was assuming that Bolt was hoping that Schaefer would simply lose interest in the matter and get off his back. But Schaefer didn't, thankfully. Instead, Schaefer, during this time where he's trying to get a hold of Bolt, also is trying to find out who he should talk to in order to report cases of research misconduct. And it turns out that something which you think would be an established process was not an established process. The hospital that Bolt was working at, which was called the Klinikum Ludwigshafen, I'm definitely pronouncing that incorrectly, this was a large academic teaching hospital, and yet this huge hospital did not have its own research or ethics committee. Instead, what Schaefer found out was that the only research ethics committee that was relevant was one that covered the entire German state that they were in. So Schaefer goes to this ethics board committee and he finds out that they don't even have the authority to comment on the integrity of research. They can only comment on if the researcher did not follow the correct ethical professional guideline. But at least it was something. So this committee looks into that specific paper of Bolt's, and they find out after almost a year of investigating that yes, this paper was done without proper ethical approval. There was no written consent to do this study. And so on that basis, anesthesia and analgesia removed the paper. They retracted it. So after that, there's clearly a target on Bolt's back. And the ethics board that investigated him, along with the hospital that Bolt worked at, came together to form an investigative committee to look into Bolt's work even further. And what they found was truly shocking. They essentially found that Bolt didn't have any original data for this study. There were no patients, there was no original data, there was no data to support the conclusion that he made at the end of his study. And on top of that, you'll remember that the other substance that was being tested in this study was albumin, right? And according to an executive at this hospital, that hospital hadn't received a shipment of albumin in over a decade. So how is it that he was using albumin in his study? So with all of this evidence, the conclusion of the committee was that this study never took place at all. And that essentially Bolt just made the study up out of thin air and published it. After they brought this to Bolt, he ended up confessing, and he admitted that not only did he fake this study, but he had forged the signatures of all of the other co-authors on that paper, who were never part of the study at all. Bolt was obviously fired after this. There was no way that he would be allowed to continue practicing medicine after this terrible forgery. But the committee didn't stop investigating there. They continued to look into his work, and by February of 2011, they had investigated 74 papers of Bolt's, and they found that Bolt had not received ethical approval for 68 of them. As a result of this, the editors of 16 medical journals, including the very prominent Anesthesia and the British Journal of Anesthesia, posted an open letter where they retracted 89 of Bolt's papers. This was the first big wave of retractions for Yim Bolt. But as I said at the start of this video, his papers have continued to be investigated by the committee over the last decade, with the most recent wave of retractions happening just a few months ago. So now Yim Bolt has a whopping 194 retractions, making him one of the only scientists to even get close to the 200 club. But the worst impact of Bolt's research isn't just the sheer number of retractions that he's had, but it's the fact that his research has directly influenced medical practice. For example, there was a meta-analysis posted in JAMA on the use of hydroxyethyl starch, and it found that when you exclude Bolt's research from the meta-analysis, that significantly impacts the findings of the study. The initial finding of the study, when it did include Bolt's research, was that the use of hydroxyethyl starch did not increase mortality compared to other forms of resuscitation. But when it did exclude Bolt's research, because, it was all fake, then the findings of the study completely changed. And instead, the use of hydroxyethyl starch was associated with increased acute kidney injury and death. Which just goes to show the potential harm that could be caused by academic misconduct. In fact, a guy called Ian Roberts, who is one of the key people investigating Bolt's research, said that the use of colloids in surgery was probably contributing to 200 to 300 deaths in the UK per year when compared to an alternative like crystalloids. Bolt's research is a key reason why colloids were still being used by the NHS. So the reason why I wanted to talk about this story today is because the conclusion that we get from it is different to the others. In the others, we were exploring how the academic system is broken, how there's not enough checks and balances in place, but in this story, the real take-home message is the impact that academic fraud can have on the real world. Not only does academic fraud undermine people's trust in medical science and other sciences, but it also costs people a lot of money. And all of the hours and time that is spent fixing the academic record because of this kind of academic mispractice, that's all money. That's all money, cost, and stuff that could be better used towards more productive purposes. And of course, the biggest cost in this case is the lives that have been lost. Bolt's research has probably directly contributed to the death of hundreds, if not thousands, of people across Europe. His research supported the use of a dangerous substance in surgery. Now, thankfully, since this time, there have been some changes made to how the journals practice. For example, all of the co-authors on a paper have to sign to say that they've actually seen the data before a paper is published, which means that somebody can't just pretend like they had a bunch of co-authors when they actually didn't. But this practice hasn't been adopted universally amongst all different medical journals or just all journals in general. And so our academic system is still very broken. It's an outdated system that relies heavily on trust and the integrity of the researchers doing the research. And even if 99% of researchers are good people with integrity who are doing honest research and publishing true results, because there are just so many scientists in the world, there are just so many people doing research, that 1% can be extremely costly for society, not only in terms of money and time, but in this case, as we've seen, in terms of human lives. So I ask you, what kind of system do you want to see? What do you make of Yim Bolt? Also, don't forget to check out Ground News, link in the description. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you next week.